Good morning. Thank you for being here for the first research forum of the Congress. So the research forum is, of all of the abstracts that are submitted for the whole Congress, we select research-based presentations that we find to be particularly interesting and compelling and important for the audience. And it's a fun session because it doesn't compete with anything else in the Congress. And we try to group things by theme. And so for this morning, we've selected abstracts that in different ways speak to ethical issues in palliative care. So I'm going to introduce our three speakers who will speak one after the other. And then we will have comments from a discussant who you recognize as Dr. Justin Sanders, who is the co-chair of the Congress and the Flanders chair. So first, we're going to have a presentation from Sinead Donnelly. Dr. Donnelly has extensive international clinical experience in general medicine. She is a senior lecturer at Otago University, Wellington, module convener for qualitative research, part of Diploma's clinical research at Victoria University, with extensive publications on general medicine-related topics. Sinead is a fellow of the Royal Australian College of Physicians and Royal College of Physicians, Ireland. Dr. Donnelly's vision is to provide best care for a patient by application of her medical skills and knowledge with, and knowledge with a holistic approach. And she is going to be presenting the experience of ethical issues at the end of life for first and second year doctors. I was terrified of death. I really wanted nothing to do with palliative care because palliative care is emotionally charged and it's ethically charged as well. Secondly, we will have a presentation by Dr. Richard Leiter. Dr. Richard Leiter is a palliative care physician at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Brigham and Women's Hospital and an instructor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. He completed internal medicine residency and a chief residency in internal medicine at New York Presbyterian Hospital. He then completed a research fellowship in DFCI's Department of Psychosocial Oncology and Palliative Care prior to joining the faculty full-time. Along with Dr. Juchas, Dr. Leiter co-created the Palliative Care Story Night series, which they've held both locally and regionally. Dr. Leiter's writing has been published in the New York Times, the New York England Journal of Medicine, Stat News, and the Journal of Clinical Oncology, among others. And finally, we will have, Dr. Leiter will be presenting clinician attitudes and perceived barriers to caring for transnational patients with cancer seen at US healthcare institutions. And finally, we will have a presentation from Ashley Mollison. She will be presenting Death and Dying in the Inner City, findings from a participatory research project to integrate palliative approaches to care. Ashley Mollison is the program coordinator for the Equity in Palliative Approaches to Care Collaborative. She's a PhD candidate in the UVic Social Dimensions of Health program. Her work focuses on family caregiving at the end of life in contexts of inequity, such as poverty, homelessness, stigma, criminalization, and isolation. For 15 years, Ashley has held various roles in relation to inner city communities, such as volunteer, researcher, frontline worker, community organizer, and caregiver. So thank you very much for being here, all of you. And Dr. Donnelly, please take it away.
Gur míle agad is búr an privilege dám bheith an seo inniu. I start in my own language because it settles me down in Irish. So I'm going to speak on, as you can see, the experience of ethical issues at the end of life for first and second year doctors. And this was part of a master's degree in bioethics. I'm repeating what that quote again, because that's one of the participants in the study said. I was terrified of death. I really wanted nothing to do with palliative care because palliative care is emotionally charged and it's ethically charged as well. So we'll just quickly go through these conflicts of interest, learning objectives, and the competency framework, which is really around research skills. So the background to this study, why this research question? The purpose of the research was, and that is very sensitive, yep, there we are. The purpose of the research was to examine the ethical issues that arise for recently qualified doctors in their first 2 years of clinical supervised practice in caring for patients at the end of life. And what does the literature say on this topic? The literature reports that the professional situation of early postgraduate doctors is unique and involves challenges that have not been fully appreciated. Especially, it is reported that the death of patients is a major source of distress. that different models of support have been developed, that teachable moments and timely reflection with senior doctors are important, that changes in working hours reduces the efficacy of the apprenticeship model of training adversely, affecting the opportunity for role modelling and senior support. So this research was qualitative, an inductive approach, which I won't go into the detail in view of the time. I undertook in-depth, face-to-face individual interviews with 13 recently qualified doctors. They're identified in the study as PGY 1 and 2, postgraduate year 1 and 2. Each person was interviewed on 4 occasions over 12 months. 21 hours of interviews were then analysed over 1 year to derive themes and concepts which I now present. This has got a lot of detail, but really it's just telling you the demographics, roughly the age range, the interview length, the number of interviews. So out of a possible 52 interviews, in fact, these junior doctors turned up 51 times. So that was a good outcome from my perspective. And the different locations, whether they were undergraduate or postgraduate entering medical school, and the different runs that they went through in that first year, and the number of first years and second years. So then another lot of detail on this, and really this is the summary of the study. The issues that these doctors, their experience and what troubled them, the care and decisions based on a patient's older age, the healthcare resources and the elderly, the deteriorating patient, prognosis, these were all their struggles, issues around the dying patients, issues around family requests, resuscitation status decisions related to their out-of-hours duties, the requests by families to increase the morphine dose. For them, the challenge was determining capacity. And then the last two I won't really discuss. And what is particularly interesting is what helps them navigate this space. So things that helped them were gratitude, senior role modelling and support, team values. As they gained more experience, that helped. When they saw good care of patients, that helped. Having a line in the sand around certain issues, debrief opportunities, and their friends and colleagues helped. And what hindered them? What hindered them were the lack of good care for the elderly, which they experienced, lack of good plan of care, prolonged resuscitations, their own inexperience, their uncertainty about their role as a doctor, their observations that patients were sometimes existing and not living, their lack of appreciation for their work, not sure of multiple simultaneous emergency calls, trying to deal with them all. Their run in neurosurgery was challenging, sometimes family behaviour, and the lack of senior doctor support was always challenging for them. So identifying an ethical issue at the end of life. So I didn't tell them this is what an ethical issue at the end of life is. I just said, tell me your stories. Tell me your stories of experience of ethical issues at the end of life. And this is how one doctor says, it makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. Those are the things that keep you awake at night. It's not the medications. It's have I done right by that person? Even practical things like resource distribution. Who gets the syringe driver? Who gets the side room? Who passes away alone because the nurse wasn't there and the family members weren't there? So the experience of patients dying and death, many aspects of dying and death are new and challenging for first-year doctors. Just meeting a patient who's imminently dying and conversing with their attending family is a challenge. As one of them said, telling someone that they're going to die is one of the biggest things you can do in medicine, and you have to really be sure that that's where we're going, and that's a first year. Out of hours, the house surgeons, that's what's the other term that they're called, PGY 1 or 2 or house surgeons, they're more frontline than during the working day, requiring them to engage with dying patients and grieving families as the responsible and authoritative doctor from the moment, like from day one. Participants, particularly in first year, find interactions with the families of dying patients very challenging. And this is how a first year doctor in their first few weeks as a doctor felt in the presence of families. With the families, sometimes when you walk in the room, you can see their relief, like, oh, the doctor's here. And you think, oh God, you've got way more faith in me than I do in myself. A first-year doctor tells the poignant story in his first week as a doctor attending a MET call, that's a medical emergency team call, for his patient who was dying. He explains how as a result of this experience, he almost didn't turn up for work the next day. When I walked round the corner, the daughter was crouched in the corridor, screaming at me to come and save her dad, rocking backwards and forwards, yelling at me, like crying. And then when I walked into the room, a wife was draped over her husband crying and saw me. She started crying more and said, "It's not looking good, is it?" On 4 occasions, house surgeons encountered the issue of requests to hasten death. And a quote, "The difficulty I found myself in was, she, the patient, looked very comfortable to me, but the daughter really, really wanted me to put a lot more morphine in her syringe driver because she wanted things to end quickly for her mother and peacefully. The issue that I had firstly is obviously and then it was kind of a euthanasia type question." So these are the factors which help the junior doctors get through this space. I've mentioned them all already, and we'll go through some of them. Senior doctor role modelling and support. The positive effect of role modelling of care by senior doctors was mentioned on 15 occasions, but was absent at times with deleterious effect on the house surgeons. One doctor found it particularly hard after a run where she felt a lot of compassion fatigue to get involved in caring for a patient in a new run, which was in general medicine, and this patient had motor neuron disease. She described what helped in this way. "As soon as I shared with my general medical consultant that I found it difficult, she just had a very human response. 'Me too,' is what she said. And then we carried on. I was just like actually, we're sharing the load. So that was really good." Several participants noted how knowing that patients were getting good care helped them. For a second-year doctor, when working in a hospice, it helped greatly knowing that the nurses really care. She recounts a touching reassurance by the nurses as she was leaving for the evening about her patient whose pain was difficult to control. The nurse came and got me and said, "Don't you worry, I'll make sure that he's going to be well looked after." Having a line in the sand. In his first 3 weeks as a doctor, a dying patient's son asked them, "Can we just end it all now?" The doctor noted that this was a euthanasia type question, but that he felt comfortable responding to the son because he had a line in the sand. So this was in New Zealand before euthanasia was introduced. And I said, "We don't do that." Clear rules provided clinical and moral clarity for the house surgeon, who was not required to justify the rules. All interviewees said they valued the opportunity to meet regularly to discuss the ethical issues arising in their care of patients at the end of life. The junior doctors debriefed in various ways, often with their senior doctor, or sometimes just among themselves. And then the factors which didn't help, which I've listed before, the factors that cause moral distress as listed here. We'll go through some of them. A first-year doctor experienced great distress at the way older patients didn't receive good care. The way I was treated, the way they treated their patients, their bedside manner, everything about it was grating. The way they viewed elderly people particularly, I just found it sickening. This was in orthopedic rehab ward. They really had the mentality, oh well, they're close to the end of their lives, so it doesn't really matter now. A lack of senior doctor support. Counterbalancing the positive effect that senior doctors' support has on junior doctors' ability to thrive, as described, the absence of such support may lead the house surgeon to leave clinical medicine. And one of the quotes, "It would be easier from a compassion fatigue perspective if I saw some of my seniors stepping up and being compassionate to the patients, which I've seen so fleetingly in this particular run. So that really helps when you see seniors being compassionate." So another example of struggle, a second-year doctor was concerned that an older patient was neglected by nursing staff as the patient was whimpering in discomfort due to positioning of the catheter bag. My registrar had to have quite hard words with some of the nurses. Why is she whimpering and crying out like this? And why is no one addressing it? Why is no one trying to figure out what's gone wrong, or at least call the doctors to come and assess her and work out what was going wrong? And another example, an exposed dying patient. He was actively dying and he had a catheter in for comfort. So the catheter had to be attended to effectively when we walked in. So this was the junior doctor coming with their registrar. They found everything was exposed. Well, you'd like to think that you wouldn't leave someone exposed like that if they were responsive. This patient was unconscious. We repositioned things. The nurse wasn't there. We went and spoke to them. What had happened was the nurse had been attending him, but had gone off to do something else. And they were intending to go back, it just hadn't happened. If that was my dad or granddad, you wouldn't want that. And it was a big enough incident for me to remember. But despite all of this, and with all of this, professional growth occurs. And the examples were in care of the elderly, caring for a dying patient. I won't go through all of these, but just care for a dying patient. It is of interest that the areas which cause great distress to first years are in subsequent interviews recognised by them as areas of growth. As the year progressed, anxiety and dilemmas related to reviewing patients who were dying and talking to their families lessened. Having knowledge and experience, for example, how to adjust medications for symptom control, recognising the patient is dying, gave the doctors more confidence. Similarly, a first-year doctor recognises that earlier in the year he would have been terrified, but at the end of his first year, he's more at ease meeting a patient who's dying and their family. I think where I've come from being terrified of having had to lead interactions with a dying person and their family to Sunday night, I knew I had to go and prescribe the syringe driver, and I thought, oh, okay, yep, I've got to do it. And I went into the room and introduced myself. So I'll skip these two. And clinical experience leads to change and euthanasia. A first-year doctor, having seen death and dying while working in general medicine, quote, "It's changed my thinking and definitely not be for euthanasia now." A first-year doctor recognised that ethics teaching in undergraduate is not geared to issues which house surgeons face in practice. I don't know if there's a way to teach the ethical things that you actually encounter. First-year house surgeons find great satisfaction in caring for dying patients. A first year identifies that dealing with dying patient was one of the times when I did some good, although it was tricky. I felt really positive about the challenge. And so really this is my summary, schematic representation. The participants' discussion of ethical issues across the interview period suggests a transition from a general awareness, they've got a sensitivity, to a more alert and proactive standpoint that involves a readiness to respond, like an awakeness. So they've transitioned from ethical sensitivity, which they got through their upbringing or through their medical training, and then they have suddenly, as a first-year doctor, an ethical awakening. As undergraduate medical students learning ethics, they explore as undergraduates what might be the right thing to do, whereas as practicing doctors, they need to decide what is the right thing to do because they're in a role where they're required to make decisions and be responsible. So if they're in a place where they're gaining this experience, which we want them to have, and they've got support, then they grow. But if they're going through this experience without the supports that they need, which can be very simple, then that will lead to an erosion of their identity and possibly even leaving medicine and personal distress as well as professional distress. So in conclusion, before we read that, as senior doctors, including registrars and as postgraduate teachers, what are our ethical obligations to support early postgraduate doctors in facing the multiplicity of death-related issues for patients, families, and healthcare staff, and in realising the impact on themselves? This tsunami of death-related issues can and often arrives within the first weeks of practice as a doctor. We don't want to block or shield the doctors from the experience, but we must support them engaging fully with the experience. So the research began with the following question: what are the experience of ethical issues at the end of life for first and second year doctors? And I conclude with a new question: what are the ethical responsibilities of medical teachers and institutions to these young doctors? And so that was published in the BMJ Supportive and Palliative Care last year. Thank you very much.
All right, great. So I'm Ricky Leiter. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here presenting our work, Clinician Attitudes and Perceived Barriers to Caring for Transnational Patients with Cancer Seen at U.S. Healthcare Institutions. It's really exciting, actually, because this was a study we started pre-pandemic in the early days. So to come back and be able to present it now feels really great. So before we start, I want to pause to acknowledge that structural racism pervades the healthcare system in which we work. Explicit and implicit biases influence clinicians, researchers, and policymakers, which results in harm to patients and families. I'm certainly not an expert in this realm, and I invite anyone in this meeting to point out inaccuracies or insensitivities in my words today. So before I get into my learning objectives and CanMed's framework, I want to start with a story that grounds this research and kind of explains the patient population I'm thinking about. So as I was starting this research, people around my institution knew that. And so one day I was sitting at my desk and I got a call from one of my oncologist colleagues, and we'll call her Dr. C. And she said, "Ricky, I need your help. I just saw a patient. She's 23 years old. She's from Saudi Arabia. She has advanced ovarian cancer. She came over here for treatment that they told her that she couldn't get at home. She was so sick that when she was at her layover in Germany, she had to be hospitalized. She's now here. Her BMI is about 18, and most of that is taken up by the tumors in her belly. Her blood pressure is low, and she looks quite sick. But she's come to us for care, and she has such high expectations of us here at Dana-Farber. I don't know what to do." That patient ended up getting admitted to our intensive care unit where she died shortly thereafter. Now, not all cases of transnational patients are this dramatic or in some cases harrowing, but that does ground us. So in what the research today I'm going to be talking about is. So it's not really a conflict of interest, but just a disclosure that I received some royalties from UpToDate for a chapter I wrote. So at the learning objectives today, at the end of the talk, I want you to recognize the importance of the clinician experience in caring for transnational patients, to be able to describe our proposed theoretical framework to understand the care of transnational patients, and finally summarize the results of our study, the qualitative study of oncology and palliative care clinicians. Here are my CanMeds, competency frameworks. So when I went to look at the existing data on transnational patients, there really aren't much. And what we do know, and these are taken from both the oncology and non-oncology population, what we do know is that they may use more resources and receive more intensive end-of-life care. So they have longer lengths of stay, are more likely to die in the ICU, more likely to receive mechanical ventilation, low rates of advanced directives completion, and higher rates of orders for full resuscitative efforts. But beyond that, we don't really know. Particularly, we don't know what is the experience of clinicians like Dr. C and my team in caring for them. So the objective of this study was to identify key sources of clinician distress and their perceived barriers to caring for transnational patients. So this was a qualitative exploratory study. We did focus groups and individual interviews. We used a semi-structured interview guide. Here are inclusion criteria. They had to be physicians, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, or social workers at our hospital, both of our hospitals, and were primarily appointed in oncology, palliative care, or social work. And we excluded people who couldn't participate or who couldn't participate in an English interview. So this was our research team. You'll see some familiar faces here. Dr. Sanders, my mentor and senior author on the study, so it's really a pleasure to have him here. And I was really lucky because we not only had sort of content experts in terms of medical ethics and medical anthropology, but also cultural experts in helping us understand what it means to care for a patient from the Middle East and from China. So this was our interview guide. We looked at, it was loosely based on a socio-ecological framework, institutional structure, the role of the patient culture, their religion, the communication challenges, what it was like to deliver end-of-life care, and the possible role of financial incentives. So we use template analysis, which is a combination of deductive and an inductive approach. And when we went to find a theoretical framework, we couldn't really find one. So what we did is we looked at existing frameworks and we came up with our own. And so I'll walk you through it. So if we have the care of the patient in the center here, then the patients and families impact that care, the clinicians impact that care, and the health systems impact that care. But what we also know is that the setting impacts that care, the patient's home countries, and where we're located in the United States. At the same time, there are these filters that influence the care. So language, culture, ethics, finances, all impact the care. And so what we were really trying to understand is what are the relationships between all of these and among all of these. And these are all dotted lines because we don't quite know them yet. And also, as Justin pointed out, when we finished sketching this out, it looks like an airplane propeller, which feels apropos for our patient population. So our codebook, very sensitive. Codebook had 5 domains. So we had the patient, the country of origin, the system, the clinician, and finally the care itself. You can see some of the domains we explored within all of those. So we reached data saturation after 30 participants, and you can see some of our demographics here. 2/3 of our participants were female, most around exactly my age. Vast majority were white, 90%, and born in the United States. And we had a nice mix of clinician types and also across palliative care and oncology. So what did we find? Well, what we find and we'll walk through these, is that there are multiple levels of barriers to caring for transnational patients. And these barriers increase clinician distress, they mediate the care that they're able to provide, and they lead to uncertainty. And that uncertainty, all of these come together to really call into question for the clinicians, the clinician-patient relationship, and their professional identity. So multiple levels of barriers to high quality care. We see this in a lack of information that the clinicians received when the patients came to them, communication difficulties, and the role of patient expectations. So here's an oncologist. But even if their expectations are taken down many notches, they're still going for that 1%. This home run phenomenon is difficult even on the domestic side. It's even more difficult when patients are dislocated from their families in another country, with another language, and with another culture. And still, they're super sick and you can't discharge them. So caring for transnational patients, what we found is that it's time and labor intensive for the clinicians, and they did not feel adequately supported by their institution. So while the clinicians universally praised the role of interpreters, they said it's logistically hard to get them. And particularly on the outpatient side, they said, I've got 30 minutes for each appointment. If the interpreter's not there right away, it's really challenging. And they recognize that the interpreters are running around trying to see everyone to meet the demand. There's more paperwork, letters, forms, back and forth to the embassy. The patients in general are more complex. And as the oncologist in our last slide showed us, it's very difficult to discharge the patients, trying to figure out these discharges logistically. So here's a palliative care physician. I think when I think of international patients, and we use this term interchangeably, I always tend to steel myself because they're just generally tougher. They're going to take longer, they're typically more complex, and usually for all of the VIP reasons and the scheduling with the interpreters and what have you, I schedule my day around that versus complexity or severity, which I think is always not a great way to think about care. So the clinicians, on top of these barriers, they're deeply uncertain about transnational patients and how to care for them. They recognize in our data that they don't know enough about the patient's culture or their religion or how to deliver goal and value concordant end-of-life care. And they worry about the role of finances. So here's a palliative care physician. I guess in some sense, culture is this kind of grayish box that kind of obscures a lot of the things we're trying to do. I'm always really curious to understand this better, but it's hard. So it just adds this layer of unknown into a lot of what we're doing. Here's an oncologist. And when someone comes from a very different country, very different culture, I just don't think we know the right language to talk with our patients about end of life in a way that's going to be acceptable to them. And so I think we sometimes get very frustrated by the unwillingness of patients to accept moving towards palliative care, comfort care, when it's so obvious to us that's what we really need. That's what they really need. And I wonder if we just don't know how to talk to these patients. So there's a recognition that there are these communication challenges, these cultural differences that they don't totally understand. And so these barriers interfere with the clinician-patient relationship. They feel disconnected from their patients. Particularly for the palliative care clinicians and the social workers, it's challenging for them to deliver the psychosocial care they're used to providing. Sometimes there was overt conflict, and there was a sense of transactional care. So palliative care physician says, in many ways, our procedure is the relationship. And having like a layer with an interpreter and then a layer where the culture could be different makes that procedure doubly hard, right? You know, it makes it harder to like have that relationship, to build that rapport, and it's out of the norm of your typical practice, and that makes it challenging. So underlying all of this is it not only jeopardizes or challenges the relationship, but it threatens the clinician's professional identity and their values. Clinicians felt like they were delivering lower quality care, they felt ineffective, and they had layers of moral distress. So here's a physician. Physician assistant. It just seems like our system is also between a rock and a hard place where like we're trying to do what's right for the patient. And even if it's not going to be what we imagine a good death would be, even to provide them with what they imagine a good death could be, sometimes can be hard to accomplish in the system that we're in. And here's an oncologist. Accepting them into the system, I think, is colluding, saying, here, we think we have something for you. If we were not getting paid for that, would we accept these patients? And so you see, I see this as not only anger, but also moral distress, and that oncologist feeling ineffective and not being able to meet the patient's expectations of them. So what does this all mean? And if we come back to our model here, so we see, so there is an influence of the home countries and the United States, and we do in fact see that language, ethics, finances, culture, all are filters on that care. But most importantly, what we see is that from the clinician vantage point, so if we put ourselves in that bottom left corner there, they can't see the patient and family side of this through all of these barriers. And so what ends up happening is their anxieties, their worries about their care, the care they're providing, is reflected back on them. And so the clinicians acknowledge, they say, we don't know. We don't know what a good death would be for these patients, but I really worry about this. But there's no other way for them to see the patient and family side. So these findings, now pre-COVID transnational patient programs were growing very quickly in the United States. That slowed down a little bit, but I suspect it will come back. So these findings have implications, I think, for where we go from here. And so if we have the clinician here, right, barriers and increased workload, inability to form relationship, and the challenge to their professional identity, well, this is emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a lack of fulfillment. We've seen these before. This is burnout. And so I think it's important for us not only to understand, it's critical for us to understand the patient and family experience to really get at what are they expecting, what are they hoping for, what's their experience of being in the United States for care. But also, as we think about interventions to improve this care, to focus on rebuilding that relationship between clinicians, their patients, and their families, and to give them that sense of professional identity and their values back. So just many, many thank yous to everyone who helped with this research, including Justin and ZGM, one of my co-authors and mentees who's in the room today, many people in our department, and all of the people who participated. And at the end, I'd be happy to take questions. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for coming so early. My name is Ashley Mollison, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Victoria, as well as I coordinate Dr. Kelly Stajahar's program of research on equity-oriented palliative care. And more than that, I'm a settler living on Treaty 7 territories in Alberta. And I work for the University of Victoria, which is on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people. No conflicts of interest. And just, I hope after this presentation, the audience has a chance to reflect a bit more about the importance of working with and learning from the communities we're aiming to reach in palliative care. Here's some CanMed's competency for the physicians in the room. And before I get started, I just want to make sure to thank my co-collaborators on this abstract, as well as our funders, and definitely our research participants and people that are working and living in the settings that we're doing our work that brings so much meaning to the work that we do. So I just wanted to talk today about a project that, I'm just going to get my notes up on my phone. I'm going to talk today about a project that we did in 2014 to 2017. And it stems from this research project, the work that we're doing today, that I'm going to talk about today. So in the study, and the report is there, the Too Little, Too Late report, we really found that people that were facing serious illness alongside poverty, homelessness, racialization, isolation, and stigma really rely on and go to the people that they trust outside of mainstream health and social care to get care at end of life. And they often experience barriers and exclusion in mainstream palliative care settings. So inner city workers are very much filling gaps in the Canadian healthcare system that rely on unpaid and invisible caregivers to do a lot of the extra support work. So when biological and legal families unable or unwilling to provide this care work, inner city workers do it. And they even sometimes become the de facto family members for the clients that they're serving. So death and dying is very much all around in the inner city. So in BC, for example, we have a toxic drug supply that's killing 6 people a day in the province. Yet we found in our original study that there was a real lack of preparation, recognition, and support for the important role that workers are playing in the lives of people with serious illness. And this, of course, results in deep distress and unmet grief needs, but not to mention reduced quality of life among people that are living in the inner city, their families, and their community. So inner city work itself is often fast-paced and focused on helping people stay alive rather than attending to and planning for care and death. So in our study, we found that workers rarely knew what palliative care was, how to access it, or how it could benefit their clients, including how palliative care was even different than mainstream care, where a lot of their clients had been excluded from. So in 2017, we began a participatory community-based action research project to engage workers in a process of integrating palliative approaches to care in their work. So the objectives were very much to understand workers' experience of death and dying in their communities and workplaces, and figure out how to adapt and embed palliative approaches to care. So this also included the development of tools and resources. So over the course of a year and a half, we worked with a core group of 15 inner city workers who were diverse in their experience and educational backgrounds, job titles, and workplaces and roles in those workplaces. They included housing and support workers, Indigenous support workers, harm reduction, and peer workers. And we also included an additional 4 participants in our group that were part of the palliative care community. So there was a physician, 2 nurses, and a social worker. And so over that year and a half, we met 18 times in what we called action team meetings. And then we also carried out 12 interventions in the community aimed at really increasing awareness of the need for a palliative approach to care in contexts of poverty, homelessness, and racism and stigma. And then in order to document the process, we collected observational field notes at the meetings. We also did repeated interviews with the participants, as well as had ongoing reflections on our team about what we were learning as we went. So interestingly, we wrote this abstract 3 years ago when the Congress was postponed due to COVID. And now 3 years later, we're actually continuing to engage in our action team, and there are new faces around the table. But we've had that perspective over the last few years to really reflect back on what we've been learning in this work together. So, and I think, as we strive towards greater equity in palliative care, I think the focus can really easily become on reaching diverse populations. But I think what often gets lost and what people are really interested in talking about and having more conversation about is really the how of doing this work. Because I think in order to change our systems that exclude and create barriers, we really need to start to do things differently, and that includes in research. So today, rather than talking about the outputs of the project, I'm really going to talk a little bit more about the how and some of the lessons that we've been learning in doing this community-based research in the context of inner city work. So the first step we had to do this work was to bring together an action team. So rather than recruiting just anyone, members of our research team used experience and relationships to identify those who are well-positioned and respected in the community to be part of our team. These relationships existed both with institutions and community partners and had a really big history. So for example, Kelly, Dr. Sajahar, she got into this work in the AIDS crisis, had lots of relationships with the health authority and community organizations. And then a few decades later, I got hired onto the project because of my relationships that I had in the community with people that were living there and working there. So since then, we've really focused on recruiting people for practicum and employment placements in our work who have experience in the settings that we're trying to do the work. The shared understanding of the context and relational histories have really built the foundation of trust for people to engage in the projects that we're doing. And then we began meeting. So we really needed to create a space. We really wanted to hear about the experiences of people around death and dying. And this really included people's experience of and making space for really hearing and sitting with and being with deep injustice of caring for those who were dismissed and excluded from health and palliative care. And so this included being with feelings of sadness and pain, but honestly, mostly anger, lots of anger. And it took time for us, even with the relationships that we already had in the community, to really show and prove to people that we were there for the right reasons, and that this project was going to be different and actually different from what they'd experienced before in research, and also was going to lead to some actionable change. So this meant that we didn't actually get to our agenda of integrating a palliative approach to care for nearly 8 months of meeting. So we really, really had lots of crying, laughing, and all the emotions together. So I don't think I can stress more the need for time, but the reality of strict timelines and required outputs in research projects can often conflict with this requirement. So while we met every 2 to 3 weeks as a group, a lot of the work that we did to engage and build relationships really happened outside of the 9 to 5. So this involved calls and texts and showing up in times of crisis, hearing and responding to challenging community dynamics, being there when we were formally or informally asked to be there at funerals, marches, gatherings, and advocacy opportunities. And this also included including using our own voice and power at the university to try to call for change that the workers were calling for in the community. So this really illustrated the value of reciprocity, meaning that it was not only about getting workers to show up for our projects and our research agendas, but that we were invested in their lives and their community, which is also our lives and community. We learned a lot about the importance of investment from people that had power. So I mentioned that the palliative care workers were also part of this project, and that was really made possible by the local health authority who dedicated staff time towards this initiative. So these healthcare workers demonstrated a commitment to community by showing up at the meetings, shadowing workers in the community, and giving out their cell phone number, actually. And for some, this had been the first time that they'd had like a direct line into a system that had been like so full of barriers and exclusion. So in turn, the healthcare workers really reported learning a lot about how palliative care was happening already in the community outside of mainstream palliative care. So it's really reflected in this quote from this palliative physician who talks about really learning more about the role of support workers in palliative care, that it's such an invisible role that they hadn't seen in palliative care. Workers were meaningfully engaged in making change in their workplaces and broader community. So during the course of the project, we with the Health Authority and community partners launched a mobile palliative care service, and that was made possible by pilot funding. But it's now a sustainable service. And but basically, when this service got started, members of our action team, the service is called PORT in Victoria, and members of our action team were part of the hiring committee for the nurse, and they also we workshopped the referral form for the service, because it was really the workers that were going to be in the community identifying people who could benefit from this service. So we wanted to make sure it was accessible. And this quote is from one of the action team participants that just really talks about how they love the idea that they're working towards something and implementing things. And we heard over and over again in our interviews like how important it was, and what kept people engaged was that there was like these little actions that were happening along the way the whole time, and people were feeling like they were moving forward an agenda. We had a huge learning around what it actually took to value multiple knowledges, because I think we say that a lot, but it's hard to do. And it became really clear in this project that the ways that mainstream palliative care was explained, who it benefits, the examples that we use to talk about palliative care really don't fit the context and the experiences in inner city settings. So embedding a palliative approach really required these adaptations that really needed to be done collaboratively with the people that are doing the work. And one thing that's kind of coming out of this project, well, we have, which we hope to release in the next few months, is that we have a 7-chapter resource that was developed with this action team. That is really about integrating the concepts that people are using in their work, like harm reduction, trauma-informed care, that kind of thing, with palliative approaches. And it's really used in the concept, and the language is really about the ways that people are talking about it in the community, and the concepts that they're using. And there's a lot of, like, there's swearing in it, like it's a little, it's fun. And so I think the process of bringing knowledge together isn't always easy. And the question and sometimes different, views of the world clash. And one thing that we're asking ourselves in our action team right now is just how we talk about Indigenous homelessness or palliative care in the context of Indigenous homelessness, and we're really being asked by the Indigenous members of our group to think more deeply about that, and that's definitely something that we're moving forward. So with the consistent meetings, support inside and outside our group, and relationships that built over time, we were really able to provide support to each other in ways that we couldn't have imagined. And this included what some participants described as grief support in the context of immeasurable loss and structural violence. And this is just a quote from one of the action team members who talks about feeling lighter after the meetings. And so I think our project, while not initially about a grief response, really taught us a different approach to grief in collective action against injustice, as opposed to individualized responses like talk therapy, which is what a lot of the workers have access to, and the only thing that they have access to. So we saw in the project really shifted perspectives on how a palliative approach to care could support and strengthen inner city work. There's lots of examples of, the ways that workers were seeing things differently. Doing this work in the context of inequity requires collaborative, community-based approaches that value the knowledges that exist in the communities that we're working in. And it requires time and space and energy outside the 9 to 5. And it requires reciprocity and engagement with people and communities in real and not tokenistic ways. But I also want to say that education and awareness are only part of it. So I think alongside these kinds of initiatives, we really need supportive organizations and public policies that recognize the value of a palliative approach to care. So people are continuing to face barriers to palliative care, and they're continuing to face barriers to caring in the way that they know how to care in the community. And they are continuing to face stigma, racism, and discrimination. And I think, you know, as much as we're trying to improve end-of-life experiences, people are at end of life because of a lack of access to care, and also, you know, experiencing preventable and unjust deaths. And so I think we're all in this room together, just in conclusion, because we see the value of a palliative approach to care and how it can benefit people and communities and families. And but I think, you know, as we talk more about equity, and I think equity is really growing, and that's exciting, and it's soon to, I think, be included in the mandates of most palliative care organizations. I really want to leave with the message that how we do equity is as important as what we do with it. And so I think we need to come to this work really thoughtfully, slowly, using existing relationships or building new ones, going to the people that know and where the work is already happening, so that we don't reproduce the harms that we're fighting against as we do this work. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to pull this out. May I ask a question of our chairs? How much time do I have? And then is there time for questions also? Okay, so I'll offer just a few moments of questions. I want to thank and congratulate the presenters. This was an extraordinary group of presentations, and also our chairs for selecting such great research. I think everybody can see that this was, you know, what David was talking about when they look for some of the higher quality abstracts that come through. I think we saw that today. In particular, as a qualitative researcher, I was really delighted to see what was here, and I wanted to highlight some of the strengths of what we saw. I mean, the sampling that was evident in these research studies was really extraordinary. 13 clinicians in the first, with 51 interviews over several months or longer, 30 participants in Dr. Leiter's study. Again, an extraordinary sample of 15 workers engaged in multiple ways over a long period of time. And I think that one of the hallmarks of high quality qualitative research is the use of what anthropologists call thick description that's evident in these rich quotations that we saw. And I think that it was really nice to be able to be led by you from these quotations into the themes that you highlighted. So I just really want to congratulate all of you on that. I'm going to comment a little bit on each of the studies in turn. For me, I will disclose that I'm not a bioethicist. So when it comes to thinking about ethics, I sort of go back to what I learned in my first year of medical school. So I think, and I'll just highlight that and remind us that some of the sort of four major bioethical principles or axes that we think about are autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. What I was so struck by today is that I think that some of the, most commonly in palliative care, the ethical principle that creates the most challenge in a hospital, at least, or at the end of life, is autonomy. And we often work with teams to try to figure out who has the autonomy to make decisions, and it's a great source of distress in the hospital, and often the source of ethical consultations. And what I loved about these presentations is that really wasn't at all what we were talking about today. And really, much more so, we were learning about clinicians' perspectives that relate to non-maleficence, not doing harm, about doing well, for people, doing good by people, beneficence, and about justice. And I think that was emphasized in each of these, and I think that was really refreshing in some ways to have a palliative care discussion that involved those other ethical principles, and they emerged in great clarity. I was struck in the first presentation by Dr. Donnelly about the degree to which, it was interesting because it was framed by these residents as an ethical challenge, that palliative care was an ethical challenge. And yet what I heard come through for me was the degree to which these early career physicians felt completely unmoored in their work. And I felt in some ways that while they framed things as an ethical form of distress, in many ways it struck me as an emotional form of distress. And much of what they described struck me as emotional challenges related to their work. I think one of the strengths of your research was that this longitudinal perspective that you took in these multiple interviews actually showed in many ways sort of the growth of a clinician, right, through their gaining of experience over time. But this idea that, as one said, you have to be sure if someone is dying, represented for me a real discomfort with uncertainty that I think was again reflected in Dr. Leiter's work. It made me think about the degree to which we need to be helping better prepare clinicians in their training for the uncertainty that we face, because it's ever present. And I just was really struck by the degree to which they felt like there were anything that could give them less uncertainty, whether it was the approval of one of their senior colleagues or this idea of having a line in the sand. It's interesting, again, because so often when people talk about having a line in the sand, it's related to things like resuscitation at the end of life. But in this case, it was used to it sort of was a guard for them against euthanasia. So what else? Let's see if there was anything else. I apologize because these words are coming out as the thoughts are taking shape. So anyway, perhaps I'll leave that. But I was struck by the degree to which we need to. The answer, in part, to the question that I think you posed was not in fact an ethical question, but an emotional one, and how we prepare these clinicians to confront the emotional aspect of their work. Okay, so Dr. Leiter, I was delighted again to see the propeller model of ethics and culture and how we think about transnational patients. And one of the things I wanted to comment on from a research perspective is, you talked about the inability to find a theory, in some ways, and I think that highlights for us actually what I found to be the importance of theorizing in qualitative and other research, because it's not necessarily theory in research is a way of grounding ourselves in our own biases in some ways and giving us a starting point so that we can defend ourselves against the critique that any researcher is potentially subject to, which is that you just found what you were looking for, right? And so I think it's a strength, not a weakness, to think about what are the phenomenon that you expect to find, and then testing that over time. But again, I was struck in this case about the uncertainty that these clinicians were faced with in what to do, and the factors that played into that, the culture and I would highlight that it was really visible culture, right? Because one of the things I've tried to impress upon clinicians over the years as it relates to culture and palliative care is that every interaction in a clinical space is a cross-cultural encounter, because so much of the culture that we carry within it, so many of our cultural identities are things that are below the surface that we never see. But in this case, it's sort of brought right to the surface, right? This sort of visible culture, and we know that people are different because of how they dress and because of how they speak, the languages they use. One of the things that came up for me from an ethical perspective here was the clinicians' concern about non-maleficence again and justice. And I was struck by, you touched on this a little bit, but the systems, because in many ways, when you have institutions like Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, like Mayo Clinic, like Cleveland Clinic, who have outposts around the world to recruit patients, to, in some senses, sell our inflated expectations about what's possible, we put our clinicians in this really difficult position, because we say to the patients around the world, come to us, and we sell our services to their governments in many cases, or to them as individuals, and they fly around the world and they arrive on our doorstep, as this patient that you described in the first study did, and then we're often facing this moral distress of what we do with them and for them. And I certainly remember many instances myself of that and how challenging that was. And I think it's wonderful that you were able to connect this, the experiences that people described as the recipe for burnout. And I think that what's interesting is to think about, if we think that these are just that these are cross-cultural encounters at an extreme, how we think about the cross-cultural encounters every day and the degree to which they contribute to these same phenomenon. Because I don't think we've thought adequately about that. So I think if there, as I think about it now, I think if there are implications of this work that are not just about transnational patients, it's about what they teach us about caring for all patients. And I think that's, I've taken the same lessons in thinking about how what we learn from caring for people with serious illness teach us a lot about what we care for people throughout the lifespan who are not seriously ill. Okay, so Ashley, that was a wonderful presentation. And I, again, was struck by the quality of the work and the level of engagement. And I think that one of the things it brought out for me is some of the sort of para-ethical principles, I think, that are evident in this work. And so one of the things you highlighted was what we think of, the word intersectionality comes to mind, right? Which is a word that describes the multiple forms of oppression that people are subject to in our societies. Poverty, racism, and the way in which these can gender, they're all of the ones that you mentioned, and the way in which they not only contribute to people's negative experiences and their access of palliative care, but also the way in which they enhance the need for palliative care by heightening people's risk to become seriously ill. One of the things I was struck by in your presentation in relation to the others was this sort of proactive ethicality around justice and the way in which you were engaging people to sort of not only be ethical in their day-to-day encounters, but really to take that ethics of palliative care out into the community and to really promote justice. And I was thinking about how the tension between that and, for instance, just doing the work that we need to do to train clinicians to feel successful in their jobs, right, in the hospitals where they're caring for people often with less supervision than they need. And so I think that's a challenge for us to think about as a group about what we, maybe you've found the answer to some extent, which it's not necessarily about physicians on the street doing, holding up signs, but really engaging with the community in ways that enhance dialogue around what we're trying to do. One of the things that I guess my final thought relates to this idea of a palliative approach, because I think that we're lucky in our work, we're often thinking about the subtleties of language. And one of the things I've seen in my arrival here is that the idea of a palliative approach is sometimes used to exclude people rather than include people, because it creates in some ways a definition or a boundary for the care that we provide. I mean, in some ways it's helpful for us to have in our minds the things that we do, which collectively can be called an approach, that are that represent our work to some degree. And I think that there's something about that palliative approach. And yet, there are times where I've heard people, my own colleagues, say to other clinicians, well, that's not how we care for people. That's not in line with our palliative approach, in ways that end up leaving people excluded from some of the necessary care that we can provide. So just something to think about that sort of came up for me in thinking about the ways in which what you're trying to do is kind of radically inclusive, right? And specifically inclusive of people who are marginalized, but that in other settings may have other consequences. So thank you so much.
So
Thank you very much, Justin, for those comments. These research forums are part of the, as some of you may know, the legacy of Robin Cohen, who always, it was very important to her to infuse this Congress with a strong research dimension. And each of the three of you, in your own unique way, has really done that. So thank you for your work, thank you for your rigor, and thank you for provoking us to think about these topics in really interesting ways. So thank you for being here, and we will see you all at the plenary at 9 o'clock.